Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku. Back with another fanfiction. This is the series of What if Deku had only 1 year left to live? Now before starting, please give this video a like. And subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. 1 year earlier, Katsuki hated many things: sweets, defeat, and the squeals of his fans. He sighed and glanced at his watch. The show was almost time. He wrinkled his nose at a strange noise and walked to a bright yellow door with black and white trim. He clicked his tongue and knocked repeatedly, ignoring the excited cries coming from inside. The lock clicked and the blonde hair of his companion appeared in the doorway. Katsuki raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation. Kaminari's high-pitched excitement was irritating and unnecessary, but it was always there. Katsuki demanded that he be allowed to enjoy the peace he deserved, speaking with irritation, and Kaminari smiled nervously. Katsuki studied the scene: flushed cheeks, bright eyes, trembling hands. It took him a moment to realize that Denki was thrilled about the response of the boy he called his dream. He remembered how they had met in a quiet, lonely school hallway, how Kaminari had burst in, pleading to be allowed to audition and perhaps join their band. At the time it had been pathetic, but Katsuki and a handful of friends had formed a band, and that had launched them into a life of bright shows. Kaminari announced that he had found their social media and lunged at Katsuki with a grin. Katsuki shoved him away and cleared his throat, saying he would tell them later and that it was time for the concert. At first it had been hard to click with the other members, but after graduation fame pushed them into the spotlight. Katsuki's best friend was steadier, patient, and calm, which Katsuki appreciated. Kirishima was one of the most important people in his life, and over time Katsuki had come to accept that and tried to close the distance he had once created. Jairu, the bassist, signaled for them to start and threw a sharp look at the others. Kirishima appeared behind Jairu at the drums while Katsuki took the guitar and lead vocals. Without another word they walked onto the stage and the music filled the room. It was going to be a sparkling, surprising night for Katsuki. The past was about to deliver a sharp jolt. At the same time, a green-haired boy pushed his way through the crowd, intending, after the first song, to hold up a series of signs. His atrophied muscles would not cooperate. He muttered that the DM and illness should just let him do this. Katsuki clicked his tongue, determined that the boy should manage it. The green-haired boy was small, but this was his last chance to lift his arms, his last attempt to relieve the ache in his chest. Getting front-row tickets had been a battle, and he had to make the most of it. He tried to raise the first poster and failed. Someone gently took the cardboard from his hands. He turned slowly and found the kind eyes of his best friend. He realized that, despite the progress he had made in physical therapy, he could not do it alone. Izuku's life hung by a fragile thread. The doctor had said he could still walk and run, but those activities were not easy, and lifting things was becoming harder as the disease progressed. The ataxia was taking his muscles slowly but painfully. His other friend, Shoto Todoroki, stepped in and said that he would lift the signs while Izuku moved to the front so that, if luck favored him, only Katsuki would see him. Todoroki wondered why Izuku had come alone and tried to carry everything, but then focused on helping. One by one the signs were raised and Izuku let out a long breath. Speaking the things he had held inside filled him with a tender, overwhelming relief. He inhaled and exhaled. Time was short and he needed to say what had weighed on him so he could feel lighter. For a moment he lost his coordination and held Todoroki's arm, but he steadied himself. This was his way of accepting things and fulfilling the fierce wish in his heart, to leave in peace. Izuku whispered a farewell, saying that the distant presence of the other had made him happy and that he would not be there to see what a world without him would be like. On stage, in the middle of the crowd, one sign caught Katsuki's eye. He signaled to Jairu to keep playing and tilted his head to read. The first sign said hello and that the writer loved him, mentioning how beautiful his eyes were. The second said they had loved him since high school. The third thanked him for existing. The fourth pleaded for him to be happy. Thanks to the dim lights and the proximity, he got a clear look at the boy behind the signs. Enormous green eyes like emeralds, green hair, and a charming smile. Katsuki watched him step back, take another boy's arm, and run away. Katsuki's heart began to race. He told himself it couldn't be the nerd he remembered, an impossible thought that stung with both bitterness and sweetness. He clenched his fists, angry and bewildered about why this was happening now. He could not be sure whether it was Izuku or a misunderstanding, but the memory of that charming smile made him close his eyes and whisper that he felt the same. Katsuki admitted to himself that he loved him too. Nervousness began to gnaw at him. He wondered why he had not followed the boy, why he had frozen like a statue. He did not know, but he resolved that this was not the end. No one took leave of Bakugo Katsuki without consequence, especially not him. Izuku did not notice the change yet, but his life was about to turn 180 degrees. Izuku smiled as he walked. The sky looked stained, long clouds streaked across the blue and turned it into a strangely magical, peaceful scene. He wondered why every day could not be like that. He wrinkled his nose when the smell of freshly baked bread slipped into his nostrils. He smiled again and wanted to go into the cafe and eat, but refined flour was forbidden in his daily diet. He sighed and kept walking through the energetic, disorderly tide of pedestrians. His legs burned, his muscles throbbed, and he felt as if his bones were vibrating. Beside him, Todoroki clenched his fists. He wondered how long he could hold back tears, how long he could face the farewell without breaking apart. It hurt beyond denial. The thought of a world without his best friend terrified him. He swallowed hard and breathed out, the question vanishing as it left his lips. Izuku whispered that people were interesting. Watching them move and enjoy small, insignificant things filled him with enormous curiosity. He stopped for a moment to admire the faint orange tone of the tree leaves and happily declared that he would be able to see autumn. He laughed with yearning and turned to Todoroki. The way the goodbye had been delivered felt cruel and careless, and he could not stop thinking about it. The most maddening question was whether the message had really been meant for him. He struck the floor with his fist and ground his teeth, convinced that if it had not been for him, his heart would not have raced so fiercely. The desperate wish to have Izuku in front of him and to study every expression on his face burned in his chest until it felt like ash. Katsuki shouted out in frustration that it was unbelievable someone would show up after so long only to say goodbye, and he wished the whole thing would go to hell. He banged his hand on the ground and continued to vent his anger and confusion. He lifted his head and blamed himself, not just for missing the person but for being a coward who had not dared to tell the truth. Fear of rejection and his own pride had been like a stumbling block in his life. He forced himself not to be dragged down by his mistakes and tried to think logically about why Izuku would say farewell. The only idea that crossed his mind was a dark, desperate thought, and he fought to keep those heavy images from overwhelming him. Kirishima's calm voice pulled him out of the trance, asking if Katsuki had recognized Midoriya and what he intended to do about the messages face him or continue hiding. Katsuki glared and straightened himself. Katsuki bit his lip in frustration, growled, and shouted that it was infuriating to be reminded of his own cowardice. He told his friend to back off and demanded to know what Kirishima knew. Kirishima explained that a few months earlier Izuku had debuted as a writer, that Mina had liked his book and had urged others to read it, and that Kirishima had been impressed. He asked Katsuki again what he planned to do. Katsuki burned with rage and stood frozen on the stage. Memories struck him like arrows. Izuku trying to greet him with a cheerful good morning, Izuku asking if Katsuki hated him, and the painful memory of the cruel reply Katsuki had once given. Even after all the years, his own personality still stung like a wound. He wondered what he would say now. Kirishima told Katsuki that for years he had been content to love Izuku from afar, to convince himself Izuku was happy without ever asking. He told Katsuki he was blunt, impatient, and bad at showing feelings, but that the chance was right in front of him and he needed to take it. Kirishima urged him to go to Izuku's autograph event in the city and gave him a gentle push. Katsuki resented being told what to do, but he also wondered if it was the right thing. The more important question was whether he could do it. The thought of Izuku's flushed face left him breathless. He realized he would regret not going, so he mumbled to himself that he had to do it. Ignoring the small victorious smile on Kirishima's face, Katsuki put on a face mask and cap and made sure his features were hard to recognize. His hoodie and sweatpants helped. Pushing rational thought aside, he grabbed his motorcycle keys and took off. As he rode, people on the sidewalk blurred into small shapes, and the urgent need to see Izuku felt like a hole in his head. He wondered if Izuku would be surprised to see him. When he arrived at the center, he found the most prominent bookstore. Banners and posters announced Izuku's visit and autograph session. Katsuki adjusted his cap and mask, bought a copy of the book, and joined the line, muttering about the crowd. Izuku breathed in and out, nervous and tense as this felt like his last autograph session. The sight of so many admiring faces filled him with a deep, melancholy weight. He felt like he was performing for a last time, about to go through one more meal, one more movie, one more moment of love. He forced himself to focus on the crowd. Katsuki took a deep breath as his turn neared. He crouched, pulled down his mask, and spoke to Izuku in a blunt, angry tone, asking why Izuku was saying goodbye to people and telling them he loved them without explanation. He watched Izuku's reaction and felt an unexpected tenderness at the young man's flushed face. Izuku seemed like gentleness personified. Izuku choked back a sound and looked away, unable to speak. The person he had loved for years was inches away. Katsuki resisted the urge to reach out and embrace him. For a moment time seemed to stop and it felt like there was nothing in the world except the two of them. They exchanged a pair of flustered, blushing looks. Izuku stammered, asking why, already feeling like he had lost the battle for Katsuki's heart. Katsuki, embarrassed and feeling as if he might explode, told Izuku to sign the book and handed him a piece of paper with a phone number, asking him to call and saying he did not want to hold up the others in line or draw attention. Katsuki glanced at Izuku one last time and left, covering his face with both hands as he crossed the threshold of the store, believing he had managed to control himself and avoid being rude. He hoped that Izuku would call. Izuku let the presence of the crowd slip away and sobbed quietly, unable to hold back the thick tears. Surprise and joy overwhelmed him. The impossible had just happened, and it came at the very moment his life was ending. He thought that he did not want to die or vanish from the world and that he wanted to see Kaken, his mother, his father, and his friends for a long time. Izuku took the paper and stared at it with wide eyes, not daring to blink. He wondered what to do, call, cry, or throw the paper away. He inhaled and exhaled. He could not contact him and dropped the bomb of the truth without thinking. He decided to practice aloud to himself, trying different ways to say it and correcting each attempt when it sounded wrong, feeling his teeth grind and his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He bit his lip, torn over what was right. If he told him, would it be a desperate slip? He did not want to die carrying a colossal regret. He clenched his fingers, unable to erase the image of Katsuki looking at him with determination and a hint of hostility. Izuku remembered those direct, piercing eyes and, beneath the bravado, he thought he had sensed a trace of affection. Suddenly he felt a hand on his back and turned to find his father smiling. The simple touch calmed him. Toshinori told him that sometimes it was better to confront things honestly to avoid suffering, misunderstandings, and disappointment, and that he had a strong feeling that the boy would understand. Izuku bit his lips so hard his skin felt damp. Both cried. It was autumn, and Izuku loved the season, but this would be his last autumn, and leaving things unsaid felt unforgivable. He hugged Toshinori, then went up to his room. Toshinori smiled sadly and let his thoughts wander through his memories. He pictured golden trees of tender recollections and darker branches of harsher memories. He picked a golden leaf and remembered the day he met Izuku, a small 3-year-old who reached out to him with tiny hands and received a warm embrace. Inko had told him that her father had died 2 months before Izuku's birth. Meeting Izuku had been a turning point in their relationship, and at 4 years old the child had called him father for the first time. As Izuku grew, so did the precious memories. First words, first bicycle rides, and many more. For Toshinori, Izuku was one of the people he loved most in the world, and the thought of losing him felt like losing half his heart. He squeezed his fists and felt how cruel life could be. He wanted to cry and turn those tears into hope, but each passing day made pretending harder. Izuku climbed the stairs slowly, counting the steps and placing his feet firmly, his fear a mocking presence. At his door he steadied himself and told himself he was ready. He took a deep breath and, knowing there was no time to hesitate, turned on his phone and dialed the number on the paper. His fingers trembled and his nerves left him exhausted and electric. After 30 seconds, Katsuki answered in that familiar voice. Izuku covered his mouth with his hand, the urge to sob evident. He forced himself to speak, deciding to spare them both more pain by being blunt. Izuku told Katsuki that he had ataxia, explained that his muscles were deteriorating day by day and that there would come a time when he could no longer move freely or walk without difficulty. He added that his heart was weak and that surgery could be fatal, and that, in theory, he only had about a year left to live. He finished by confessing that he loved him and then thanked him for his curiosity before ending the call and throwing his phone onto the bed, finally allowing himself to cry. Katsuki reacted with intense shock and anger, cursing as fear took hold of him. He remembered their high school days and all the time he had wasted being stubborn, and the news slammed into him. He forced himself to calm down and called back. After a few rings, he told Izuku to meet him at the Uravity Cafe on Saturday at 9 in the morning and warned him not to be late, then cut the call. 1 year was all he needed to be happy. Izuku blinked repeatedly. He pressed his fingers together and bit his lip gently, wondering if this was a dream. He stared at the paper with Kaken's number written on it and felt a thrill that pushed him toward euphoria. Izuku exclaimed that Kaken wanted to see him and talk to him. His heart lurched when he noticed the word pity, and the thought hit him like a violent wave. Izuku whispered to himself, afraid that the reason might be pity. Melancholy settled over him with a brutal speed. He resented his own imagination for conjuring endless scenarios and causing pain he had not yet earned. He sighed and told himself not to worry about something that had not happened, but still wondered if he would lose anything by going. He decided he would not, and shook his head as time ate away at him. He gave his outfit one last look, black pants and a greenish hoodie. He laughed softly at how his clothes matched his hair. Out of habit, he touched his freckles. His mother had said they were like twinkling stars. He often caught himself counting them when looking in the mirror. They were childish, yes, but they were his and that made them special. He pressed his fingers to his cheeks and pulled them, watching them color and then settle. He smiled at the smallness of it. Izuku liked to hug the people he loved, carefully and respectfully, mindful of personal space. His phone chimed like a bell. The message instructed Midoriya to call his parents or the sender if anything went wrong and expressed a genuine wish for him to have a happy afternoon. Izuku tilted his head. The cafe wasn't far from his home. It would be an 8 to 10-minute walk. He had worked hard during physical therapy and the walk would be easy. He grabbed a hat and stepped outside into a sky that had been taken over by clouds. A cold breeze danced among the trees, whose leaves were turning yellow and orange and falling gracefully to carpet the ground. The sound of leaves crunching made him smile. At the same time, Katsuki inhaled and exhaled, trying to understand why he was so nervous. He chided himself silently. The answer was obvious. Despite his violent, sometimes irrational personality, he had been drawn for years to a simple boy who loved comics and action figures. Katsuki also liked a certain kind of hero, but he was not an extremist. He scolded himself inwardly for the feelings that made no sense with his usual pride. Katsuki muttered that he did not know what was wrong with him. Impatience gnawed at him as he stood in the cold station and checked his watch. He had arrived half an hour early. He hated feeling weak and desperate, but being at Izuku's mercy did not feel bad. It felt tender in a way that surprised him. The phrase 1 year of life echoed in his head like a poisoned thorn, repeating over and plunging him into chaos. He wondered if he could make Izuku happy, even for a short time. He feared that Izuku might not want to be with him, that Izuku might just want to draw out whatever feelings Katsuki had, and above all he wondered if he was ready to say goodbye. A message on his phone pulled him back. It read that people were supporting him and that even the boss was behind him. Katsuki clicked his tongue, decided that brooding outside the cafe was pointless, started his motorcycle, and arrived at his destination in under 2 minutes. He took his bag, entered the cafe, and searched for the farthest seat. He wondered if it would rain as he watched the gray clouds. He kicked at the wooden floor, irritated by the slow movement of the clock hands. The cafe's walls were decorated with posters of old films, giving the place an attractive, refined charm. He thought of the owner whose round face he had nicknamed and appreciated the care put into the business. He sighed again. Katsuki rummaged in his backpack and pulled out a small black box. He believed words were overrated and he did not want his rough personality to ruin the moment. Presenting a tangible thing seemed the most sensible approach. He intended the meeting to be brief but meaningful. Izuku walked slowly through the cafe, wrinkling his nose at the overwhelming aroma of fresh coffee. He scanned the room and found Katsuki, then made his way toward him with cold sweat and a shaky stride. Every step felt heavy and precarious. Katsuki stood up abruptly, telling Izuku that this would be quick, and greeted him with a serious, slightly hostile look. He thought to himself that he had been defeated by Izuku's gentleness. Katsuki noticed Izuku's green eyes, likening them to two emeralds, and forced himself to get through the moment quickly. Katsuki handed Izuku the black box, explaining that Izuku could ask for anything he wanted and that he had already put money in the box. Their fingers brushed when the box changed hands, and an unexpected warmth colored Katsuki's cheeks. He told Izuku to read everything inside the box and then call him, insisting that Izuku would do it, and he emphasized that none of this was out of pity. Without another word, Katsuki walked away in long strides. He had done it, and the realization filled him with relief and a fierce, beautiful happiness at seeing Izuku alive and moving before him. Meanwhile, Izuku smiled. The moment had been brief, but it had been enough to brighten him. Izuku later reflected that it had only been 5 minutes, but thanked Katsuki for making him happy. He felt his eyes grow wet not from pity and wiped his tears with the sleeve of his hoodie. The salty drops burned slightly as his face flushed and his heart raced. He told himself that coming had been worth it and held the box gently. After so many years, Izuku felt as if he had taken down the moon, and he dared to think that he might be the sun. The moon was Bakugo and the sun was Izuku. It became clearer that way. Izuku covered his face with both hands. His cheeks burned and his lips trembled. Carried away by euphoria, he sank into a warm, happy cry. Suddenly his world seemed filled with a cascade of roses and clouds of cotton. Murmurs and excited squeals filled the room, giving it life and affection. By reflex he bit his lip and wondered why, after so long, this had never been said to him. He asked himself why it had been kept silent, thinking they could have been happy for much longer and he would have left with more memories. He wiped his tears with the sleeve of his sweatshirt, his hands and heart racing. The terrible what-if began to play with his soul. What if they had spent more time together? What if Katsuki had let him color his life for longer? He picked up the papers and read them again. They were notes, song lyrics, and many beautiful, delicate drawings. There were teasing phrases like calling him a nerd and asking why he was so adorable, and more complicated lines that hinted at conflicted feelings. Scattered among them were stronger admissions, statements of love, calls to secrecy, and declarations of how pure Izuku was to the writer. The paper was old and wrinkled, showing the passage of years. Izuku smiled. The creations were wonderful. The writer Katsuki seemed like someone who tasted both sweet and bitter. With care he turned a page and tilted his head at a title, The Melody of My Soul. He wondered why only the title remained. Setting the drawings aside, he examined them more closely and his surprise turned to a different kind of ache. Katsuki had drawn him majestically, sketch after sketch of Izuku alone, and then one different piece. In that drawing Izuku stood beneath falling snow. Beside him there was a silhouette a few centimeters taller with hair forming slight spikes. Izuku called Katsuki by his childhood nickname and breathed in and out, heart racing at the sight. He insisted to himself that he was at Katsuki's side. He knew Katsuki had not finished the drawing, or perhaps had intended to leave it incomplete, as if Katsuki saw himself as no more than a smudge in Izuku's life. Determined, Izuku searched for Katsuki's number and picked up the phone. He hesitated, remembering that the blonde had ignored him most of his life and that the only word Izuku had often received was a harsh, single insult. The bedroom door opened and his parents stood in the doorway, their eyes narrowed as they read the scattered notes. They urged him to call. Izuku jumped slightly and nodded. His parents gave him a knowing wink and left the room with quiet steps. Toshinori held his wife's hand. All they wanted was for Izuku to be happy until his last minute. They took a deep breath because they had to speak to Katsuki and hoped for an honest response. Meanwhile, Izuku murmured to himself, unsure what he would say or where they would meet. Without overthinking, he called. After a few rings, Katsuki answered with a groggy voice. Izuku had composed his greeting and then faltered, but Katsuki cut him off. Katsuki told him that he already knew Izuku was at home because their parents lived close and Katsuki was visiting them. Katsuki said he would arrive in a while and admitted that he had expected the call, referring to Izuku with the rough nickname he had always used. Izuku opened and closed his mouth, breathless. He lay on the floor and thought that maybe, just maybe, being with the moon was not impossible for the sun. He smiled like a child at Christmas. To Izuku this felt like an early present. He wondered if he would be able to celebrate Christmas Eve normally, how his parents would mark the holiday, and whether there would be cake or a tree. It was a melancholy line of thought, but it helped him keep going. He even whispered that he should stick glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and, by habit, fetched his notebook to write the idea down. Katsuki stormed around the house in excitement, cursing under his breath. He had never showered so quickly in his life. Happiness and euphoria ran through his veins. He searched for the perfect outfit, put on a bit of cologne, and gave himself a final look in the mirror. He shouted that he had waited years for this, his eyes wet. For the first time in years he had another reason to keep living. He wiped his face roughly and hurried out the door, determined to reach Izuku fast, to see him, touch him and press his cheeks. He wanted to count Izuku's freckles and trace them with his fingers. He said his goodbyes and his parents exchanged looks of complicity. Katsuki ignored them and set off. When he arrived at the house he was surprised to find Izuku's parents waiting on the threshold. Confused, he wondered if he would be turned away. He snapped that they could not do that to him. Izuku's mother could not speak, she was crying. Izuku's father managed to say through tears that Katsuki should make Izuku happy until his last breath. Katsuki understood and, for a moment, found himself unable to answer. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Katsuki apologized for arriving late, for coming years late, and he spoke with sincere regret. He promised to make Izuku happy. They directed him to Izuku's room and he climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his mind racing with things he had rehearsed for years. Opening the door without knocking, he was left speechless. Izuku had arranged a circle of notes, drawings and songs. The boy lay in the center, staring at the ceiling and admiring it. He looked like an angel come down from the sky and a cherub the world did not deserve. Katsuki stepped inside and took in the scene, feeling the weight of everything he had held back for so long. Izuku turned his head slightly and a gentle, hopeful expression crossed his face. Katsuki approached cautiously, feeling both fear and a fierce desire to protect this fragile happiness. He told himself he would keep Izuku safe and do everything he could to bring light to his days. Izuku listened, overwhelmed with gratitude, and allowed himself to believe that perhaps their time together was only just beginning. Katsuki sat a meter away from Izuku. He cleared his throat and arched both eyebrows. Izuku blinked in surprise. Kaken was there, sitting near him. With his heart in his throat he got down on his knees and understood that the blonde wanted confirmation of his feelings. He inhaled and exhaled. Izuku confessed that he loved Katsuki. Katsuki replied with a crooked smile that he believed he loved Izuku. Katsuki then asked if Izuku would be with him until his last day, a question that required all his courage and every feeling in his chest. Izuku promised that he would be. When Katsuki heard that, Izuku could not stop crying and, between sobs and small jumps, he asked again if Katsuki would let him live in his heart for a year. Katsuki answered that Izuku had lived there for years and would remain until he died. After answering, Katsuki extended both arms, waiting patiently for Izuku's warmth and told him to come, saying he had waited years and was not going to let anything ruin this. With a nervous smile, Izuku sat on Katsuki's lap and leaned into him, offering a grateful embrace. Katsuki allowed it, blushing occasionally and feeling a warm, steady comfort. The moment felt overwhelming and joyful for both of them. For Izuku, it was like holding happiness in the palm of his hand. Although it would only be for a year, he was sure it would be worth it. The moon was happy. Katsuki breathed deeply, knocked twice, and waited a few seconds for the door to open, but only silence answered. Growing impatient and angry, he kicked the door open. The sole of his shoe struck the wood so hard that the hinges creaked. Katsuki shouted at Mirko to open the door. He was furious and had no time for this. Clicking his tongue, he realized the others were in the boss's office. Mirko watched him with a raised eyebrow and a dark, conspiratorial look. Katsuki demanded what they thought they were doing, pointing accusingly at everyone and folding his arms. He did not leave because his problem was more important. Mirko told him he had arrived at a good time and, with understanding, explained that the band would take a one-year break. Katsuki grunted at her words. Mirko knew about the difficult situation he faced and how hard it would be for him to get through it. She sighed and thought about how unfair life could be. Even though Katsuki could be an idiot, neither he nor his partner deserved something so cruel. Closing her eyes, she remembered Kigo and wondered what she would do if he were gone. She pushed the thought aside and refocused on the others. Mirko said that the band members had insisted they could not continue without him and that it was all or nothing, presenting the decision as their gift. Katsuki went blank at the news. He turned his head, raised a hand in a brief, awkward farewell, and left. His heart felt moved, but he would never show it. Doing so would wound his pride. He stepped outside and read the flyer he had picked up, a drive-in theater advertising an old-fashioned movie experience. He thought about Izuku and whether he would like it. Katsuki was not the type of boyfriend to be sentimental, but he was willing to be for Izuku. He planned to take him and give him as many moments of happiness as time allowed. The thought made him shiver with a mix of tenderness and fear. Why Izuku, of all the millions of people in the world, had to suffer lingered in his mind. Suddenly his phone sounded with a message. An unknown number had written that it was Todoroki and that he wanted to meet in half an hour at the Uravity Cafe. Katsuki blinked, put on his mask and grabbed his keys. At the cafe he sat at the far table and waited. Shoto Todoroki arrived minutes later, looking the same as always, his hair unchanged since high school. Shoto sat across from him and immediately bombarded him with questions about whether he knew what he was getting into, whether he understood the illness, whether he would regret his decision, and whether he was only giving Izuku false hope. Katsuki clicked his tongue and found Todoroki's tone more like that of an older brother than a suitor. In Katsuki's mind, Todoroki had always seemed to care for Izuku in some way. Todoroki then added seriously and directly that he himself did not like Izuku and that he had liked Katsuki's bandmate Denki, but that Denki had never been interested. Katsuki laughed, incredulous at Todoroki's lack of awareness. He thought Todoroki was distracted and stubborn, but the questions were reasonable given the gravity of the situation. He knew he had to answer or Todoroki would not let the topic go. Katsuki said that first, he knew what he was getting into and would not have done it otherwise. Second, he had already learned about the illness. Third, only a fool would regret loving someone like Izuku. And fourth, he had loved Izuku for years. He slammed the table in frustration and, after a jab at Denki for missing Todoroki's obvious hints during high school and failing to reply to a recent message, told Todoroki to get lost. Todoroki was left speechless as he tried to process the information, surprised by the depth of Katsuki's resolve and the confession about Izuku. He felt foolish and checked his own messages, finding one from a user named Yellowbolt that confirmed some of what Katsuki had said. Todoroki then asked Katsuki to promise that he would be with Izuku until the end. The phrase weighed heavily on everyone, reminding them of the grim possibility they all feared. Katsuki lowered his head, bitterly hating those exact words, and then replied that of course he would be there and that they would stay together until the last second. A heavy silence fell over them. Izuku smiled. He had written non-stop for 2 days. The same day he saw Katsuki, he had made a decision. The last thing he would leave in this world would be a romantic novel. The smile returned, but carried a hint of melancholy. Who would continue the writing if his fingers failed? He sighed and thought, Maybe his father would type everything he dictated to finish the book. He shook his head gently, thinking negatively did not help and only frightened him. He stood and stretched his arms. It did not hurt as much today. Of course, as the days passed, the pain would push him to his limits. The door opened and his mother entered. He did not need to turn to recognize her. He knew her sweet, gentle footsteps. Inko hugged his shoulders and planted a soft kiss on his left cheek. He laughed and leaned into the embrace. The arms of his mother were comforting and steady. Sometimes, held between them, he felt that everything would be all right, that he could live a long, pleasant life. He bit his lower lip and wondered why this was happening to him. He sighed again and dismissed the thought as pointless. Life could be sad and senseless, but it also had its moments of sweetness. He resolved to make the most of this year. With a slowness that was almost painful, his mother let him go and pressed his shoulders lightly before remembering the person waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She bit her lip. She was happy and hoped he would be brave until the end. She gave him one more gentle hug and asked if she should tell the person downstairs to come up. Izuku's eyes opened with eager hope at the suggestion. Inko held back her tears and said he could go out anywhere as long as he did not overexert himself. Inko inhaled and exhaled. Even seeing him so lively, thinking about a farewell was painful. Izuku nodded and began to tidy up. He put away all the drafts of his book, his drawings, and his poems. His mother watched as he adjusted his appearance and checked his reflection again and again. When he was ready, she kissed him one last time and went downstairs. She nodded in gratitude to Katsuki at the stair landing and thanked him for being there and for making Izuku smile. Tears began to fall from Mrs. Midoriya, and Toshinori arrived at the perfect moment to embrace her. Katsuki responded quietly and with surprising calm, thanking them for letting him do this and for giving Izuku life. He did not want to witness more tears, so he went to Izuku's room. He knocked twice and entered, thinking how endearingly vulnerable Izuku looked. Izuku wore a long green sweatshirt, tight black pants, and his distinctive red sneakers. The freckled boy offered a nervous smile, played with his fingers, and watched Katsuki with bright, shining eyes. Katsuki scowled but greeted him roughly and asked if he was ready, then urged him to get up and go out. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Katsuki slammed his foot on the floor, crossed his arms, and demanded to know where they were going. Katsuki mentally chastised himself for not speaking more kindly to him. He thought he needed to practice softer words. Izuku asked meekly where they were going. Despite the years, he still could not control his emotions around Katsuki. He felt excited, happy, and euphoric just to have him there. After so long, he finally had him in front of him, and an idea danced at the edge of his thoughts. Without hesitation, Izuku threw his arms around Katsuki's neck in a sudden, tight hug. Katsuki blinked, his cheeks coloring. He swallowed and returned the embrace, unable to let go right away. They held a quiet embrace for a moment. Izuku thanked him for coming and smiled warmly. Katsuki grumbled about being called sweet, helped him into a coat, and dragged him toward the door. He explained that he had the manager's truck for the day and told Izuku to get in. First they would get sweets and then go to a movie. Izuku made a small leap of joy at the plan. Katsuki started the engine, and within minutes they arrived at a quaint cafe. He bought candies and pastries, having consulted with Inko about Izuku's preferences. Inside, Katsuki felt content watching Izuku eat eagerly, smiling and impatient to taste everything. It gave him a calm, fulfilling feeling he had not expected. He teased Izuku about whether he would finish all the treats, whether he could tolerate the cold, and whether he wanted burgers for dinner. Izuku answered that he would eat everything, that he could handle the cold but not extreme temperatures, and that he wanted burgers for dinner. Katsuki checked the weather on his phone and noted that 20 degrees would not be so cold, relieved that his plans would not be ruined. At one point, Katsuki found himself staring at the plain white wall, trying to ignore Izuku's curious, amused look. Conversation was not his strong suit and he felt unsure what to say next. Frustrated, he covered his face with both hands. Izuku sensed his trouble and shook his head gently, comforted by the fact that Katsuki had not changed and that steadied him. Izuku brightened and asked if it was great to be in a band. Katsuki snapped back in a hostile tone and asked why he wanted to know, clearly irritated. With effort, they eased into a more pleasant conversation. Katsuki watched his watch and made Izuku eat faster. After they left, they bought burgers and drove to a busy, crowded venue parking lot. Katsuki told Izuku to get out of the truck while he parked and warned him not to complain because he would pay the bill. He muttered that he could spend all the money he had on him. The rough words sounded almost affectionate in a blunt way. Izuku never imagined he would be like this with Katsuki. Seeing him from afar had become a habit, and now he had him so close. He could touch him, and more than anything, he felt deeply cared for. Remembering his drawings and looking at Katsuki, his breath caught and he felt overwhelmed with emotion. He had cried. But he couldn't help it. The ticking of the clock of his life made his chest ache. He was sure people were tired of seeing him cry, but his heart couldn't bear the pressure. And tears were his escape. Suddenly his eyes widened. He hadn't asked yet, it was tacit, but he needed to say it aloud. For a few seconds he was speechless. Dazzled, he looked at the big screen in the distance. They were at a drive-in. In silence he watched as Katsuki climbed down from the truck, searched for a blanket and pillows, and arranged everything in the back. Katsuki signaled with his hands for him to hurry and asked if he was coming or not. Nervous, Izuku walked over and settled onto the pillows. Katsuki covered them both with the comforter and they lost themselves in the images and sounds on the screen. They were watching Casablanca. Izuku took a deep breath, moved closer to Katsuki, tugged at his shirt, and asked if Katsuki wanted to be his boyfriend, admitting that no one had asked before. Katsuki blushed, took his chin, and kissed him gently. Overwhelmed, Izuku embraced him. He had tried not to cry, but his eyes surrendered. He sat on Katsuki's lap and begged not to be forgotten, pleading that Katsuki continue with his life but keep him in his heart. Katsuki replied that it wasn't about following orders. He would not forget him and he believed they were already a couple. He said he loved him, calling him an idiot in a serious but tender way. Izuku laughed, so typical of Katsuki. Katsuki spoke with resolve, and for some reason Izuku felt that everything would be all right. A comforting silence settled over them and the sun shone brighter than usual. Izuku kept writing, determined that his love story should be tender and sensitive, that it should bring him to the verge of tears and then return him to a smile. He tilted his head and wondered what Katsuki was doing. 2 months had passed since they began their relationship, and Izuku smiled at the thought that Bakugo still stood by his side, that he held his hand and squeezed it in support and held him close in quiet affection. His friend Ida had asked a terrible question: what if Bakugo was with him out of pity? That day Izuku had gone through the letters and drawings again. Most of them looked old and creased, proof of the slow passing of years. That night he did not sleep. He trusted that Katsuki would not lie to him, but he could not stop thinking about Ida's question. At last he called Katsuki. After 2 rings, Katsuki answered, and Izuku smiled at the sleepy voice on the other end because it sounded tender and familiar. Izuku asked if Katsuki was with him out of pity. A heavy silence followed. Katsuki sighed. He had expected the question. He sat on the bed, stretched his neck, and decided to address it head-on. Katsuki told him that he would only say it once. He would never stay with someone out of pity. He had no time or inclination for that, and he had spent years loving Izuku. He told Izuku to stop doubting and then ended the call. After hanging up, Katsuki repeated softly that he had loved Izuku for years. Sinking into the world of dreams, Izuku laughed, wiped the few tears that had come, and covered his face. Hearing those words filled him with a deep warmth. He touched his flushed cheeks and felt a tickle in his throat from overwhelming emotion. He reached for water and tried to stand, but his coordination failed. His legs weakened and he collapsed onto the wooden floor. He tried to get up and could only manage a few inches before his body pulled him back down. He inhaled and exhaled and cried out that now was not the time. He struck at his thighs, barely feeling the pain, but his efforts did not bring him to his feet. Tears gathered and spilled free, sobs filled the room as he called for his parents. Footsteps approached, his mother opened the door and his father rushed toward him. Izuku begged for help, stunned and unwilling to accept what was happening. He called for his mother again and she wrapped him in her arms while signaling his father to prepare the car. They would have to go to the hospital. For a few minutes, Izuku's crying was the only sound in the room. He tried to stand again and fell. The floor felt like a vast pit swallowing him slowly. He wondered if all he could do was cry. He struck his legs once more and his mother gently held his wrists. His father lifted him carefully and placed him in the back seat of the car. His mother sat beside him, still holding him. He could not think clearly. He worried about Katsuki and whether he would leave him alone. He closed his eyes and counted to 10. When they arrived, his father carried him toward the hospital entrance, but Izuku forced him to stop. He pleaded that if he went inside, then everything would be confirmed. He feared that if he entered, he might not come out the same, that he might not be able to walk beside Katsuki anymore. For Izuku, it felt like the beginning of the end. Katsuki walked through the hospital corridors with trembling hands, worrying about how Izuku was doing and whether he was afraid. He stopped and lowered his eyelids, and in a hiss of fury he told himself that Izuku should not dare to try to leave him. He knew Deku well enough to imagine what was going through that stubborn brain. He tilted his head as the smell of medicine and alcohol slipped into his nostrils, a strange, sad, desperate scent. And tears drifted through the halls. The presence of death seemed to brush every corner. He clicked his tongue, kicked the floor and kept walking. He asked at reception and was pointed the way. Each step felt eternal. This was his boyfriend, his other half was the one who was hurt. It was normal to feel destroyed, was it not? These were new feelings and, in a way, they terrified him. He swallowed hard, wondering what would happen when Deku was gone. His heart flipped painfully, every step hurt and 1,000 cruel, sad images danced through his mind. He forced himself to push those thoughts away. In the distance he spotted the unmistakable green hair of Inko Midoriya. He hurried and stopped heavily. Katsuki arched an eyebrow in surprise when he noticed Denki sitting in the far seats, holding a sad Shoto's hand. He dismissed it as unimportant. Inko greeted him with a warm, nostalgic hug and then asked him to enter. Katsuki approached the doorway and bit his lip, not wanting to see Izuku sink into despair. He hoped to give him a little light, to return some happiness. He moved the curtain aside and studied Izuku with narrowed eyes. White clothing, and 4 drip, and blankets. His gaze traveled inch by inch over Izuku's face. The emerald eyes had lost some of their usual brightness. The cheeks were flushed and the face swollen from crying. Katsuki's chest trembled and reverberated through his body at the sight. Quickly, he took Izuku's hand and squeezed it gently and affectionately, a gesture Izuku recognized. Izuku smiled at the reassurance that Katsuki was there. Outside, clouds swallowed the sun and the day took on a dull gray tone. Izuku pushed himself up as much as he could and signaled for Katsuki to come close enough to touch him. Katsuki grunted, obeyed, and when they were side by side Izuku clung to his neck and cried. Katsuki murmured that Izuku should stop crying so much, teasing that it would only make his face look worse than usual. He heard Izuku's soft laugh and wrinkled his nose at the warmth it sparked. Suddenly Izuku shoved him with unexpected force. Katsuki was surprised and then scolded him sharply for pushing people. Izuku then asked, worried and serious, whether Katsuki really wanted this, explaining that he did not want to tie him down and that he might not be able to walk side by side with him. He managed a small, sad smile. Izuku had thought of Katsuki all night, of freedom and of love. He wondered whether Bakugo would cry for him or feel lost. He clenched his fingers, not wanting that for him. Izuku had never expected to have Katsuki. He had resigned himself to the idea of dying without ever holding him. He forced a snort at his own tenderness and then gave in, admitting that he wanted to be selfish in the little time he had left. Katsuki frowned in confusion at Izuku's words. They shared a quiet, meaningful moment. Katsuki then told Izuku to allow himself that selfishness and affirmed that this was what he wanted as well. Izuku laughed, and nearby Inko, Toshinori, and Todoroki opened their eyes in surprise at the sound. None of them had managed to make him laugh like that, only Katsuki could. Todoroki asked what would happen next and whether Izuku would stay in the hospital. Izuku explained with a small smile that the doctor had said he could try a short course of physical therapy to determine whether his legs were a lost cause or not. Katsuki felt a deep sadness. Bit by bit, the person he loved was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Izuku then told Katsuki that he wanted to say something, that Katsuki was the melody of his soul. Katsuki blushed, remembering the adolescent letters he had once written. Despite everything, Izuku still meant that much to him. The sun might lose its shine, but the moon would share its light. Katsuki blinked as the sun burned his skin. He wondered why the hospital windows were so high. He craned his neck and frowned, guessing the hour to be past 8 in the morning. He studied the room slowly. The white, neat walls were covered with images, posters, and photos of superheroes and a few of his band. It felt sad in a way. To arrange and decorate the place to one's taste sometimes meant permanence. A hollow pain began to open in Katsuki's chest. He was terrified of goodbyes. He rose heavily and went to the window. Through the glass, the tide of passers-by flowed anxiously, faces ranging from serene to sad, bored, and occasionally joyful. Izuku was one of those people with rosy cheeks and a bright expression. Katsuki walked to the bedside and watched Izuku sleeping, smiling and drooling lightly. He stepped closer to study the freckles that seemed like tiny constellations scattered across his fine face and felt a brief, soft smile at how tender Izuku looked even asleep. He held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. Izuku roused and, still drowsy, reached out and rested his arms around Katsuki's neck. He murmured a soft morning greeting and laughed lightly. Katsuki stepped back and crossed his arms, his voice rough with habit and the shame that sat beneath it. Suddenly a sharp constriction gripped Katsuki's chest. Air became scarce, his abdomen throbbed, and tears poured down his face. He could not take it in. He could not accept loss now that the sun still shone. He sobbed and moved uncontrollably, whispering that he did not want this. Seeing Izuku, Katsuki hit the emergency button. Seconds later a doctor and several nurses arrived, urging that they had to stabilize him and prevent cardiac arrest. A nurse brought in a defibrillator as the medical team worked to prepare the patient. A nurse told Katsuki to step outside. He stood frozen, barely hearing, heart racing with the fear of an ending that felt impossible. Sounds became overwhelming: alarms, voices, machines. He bit his lips so hard he tasted iron, then came out of the daze with a desperate, guttural sound. Katsuki pleaded loudly for help and begged that Izuku not die, calling him Deku and imploring anyone to save him. Toshinori entered in a rush, barking commands and urging the staff to act. He took Katsuki by the shoulders and forced him out of the immediate room so the team could work. Izuku's world went black as he lost consciousness. Outside, Katsuki inhaled and exhaled until his throat tightened. Izuku's parents wept and pleaded for him to be saved. Katsuki sank into a chair and clenched his fists. Mrs. Midoriya took his hand to offer support and to find strength for both of them, and strangely, it helped. 10 minutes later, a nurse informed them that Izuku was stable. Katsuki let out a massive sigh of relief. Despite the ache inside him, he smiled because Izuku had survived. For a moment his mind wandered to a darker thought. This felt like only a preview of harder things to come. They were allowed into the room again. Katsuki went in first, moving slowly and warily, afraid he might lose the sight of Izuku at any moment. He thanked Izuku inwardly for surviving and waited for him to open his eyes and say his name. After 2 hours, Izuku blinked and lowered his eyelids again, exhausted as if from a terrible nightmare. In a soft, half-conscious voice, he asked whether the man at his bedside was Kaken or Mom. Katsuki recognized the confusion and, with a quiet resolve, understood that he would do anything for Izuku. Izuku wrinkled his nose. He had almost finished 70% of his book, and being so close to the end filled him with pride. Still, each passing day made it harder to press the keys on his computer. He sighed and knew it was time to ask for help. He did not want this, he would never want it, but it was not his choice. His body felt like the leader that stole his breaths and desires. He closed his eyes and searched for his deepest longing. The image of Katsuki calling him a DMN nerd invaded his mind. Why that insult? He laughed at. Himself, was he really asking for another insult? He had simply learned that this was Katsuki's rough way of loving. Suddenly he remembered the pain in his chest and the shortness of breath. A lump formed in his throat as he wondered if he had almost died. 3 days had passed without seeing Katsuki. Izuku felt anxious and could not remember much of that moment beyond suffering and unconsciousness. He bit his lip. He wanted to see him, to kiss him, to hold him. Where was he? He turned his gaze to the window. Sunlight poured in, warmth at its peak melting the pavement outside. He stretched his hand and tried to move his fingers. They moved more slowly than before. He spoke to them with clarity and sadness, telling them to keep going. He was almost done writing. Time slipped by, dragging him toward the bottom of an abyss. He had tried physical therapy and could not stand. He no longer felt his legs, only an empty numbness in the lower part of his body. Desperate, he reached for his computer and continued the novel, typing with difficulty but continuing. He was convinced the sky laughed at him. His misfortune felt colossal and hell watched, attentive and discreet, as if waiting for fresh prey. He asked aloud whether hell or heaven was more attractive and captivating. He blew out a breath, thinking like that did not help. He clicked his tongue and sat alone, his breathing the only sound breaking the silence in the solitary room. Far away, he could hear the murmur of footsteps and whispers. Suddenly the door opened. Todoroki strode in and stopped at the bedside. He observed Izuku calmly and said slowly that they were going out and that fresh air would do him good. Izuku raised an eyebrow and tilted his head in confusion, but he set aside his doubts and nodded. What did he have to lose? After all, loneliness had been his companion that day. Shoto helped him into a black wheelchair. He settled with reluctance and forced a strained smile. It had been many days since he had left the hospital. He hated the situation and tried not to cry. He needed to be strong. Todoroki said he would put something on him and that Izuku's mother had a surprise. Todoroki showed a black blndfld and placed it over his eyes. Izuku wondered what the surprise could be. The ride was short, or maybe Todoroki's car was fast. Nervousness gnawed at his bones. Was it the BFLD or the anxiety of curiosity? They entered a crowded place. The number of voices told him they were among many people. Thousands of cheerful conversations swirled around them. They moved forward slowly until all the sounds abruptly fell away. Todoroki removed the blndfld and Izuku was speechless. It was not his mother or father who waited. Katsuki was seated at a beautiful ivory piano, wearing a slightly disheveled tuxedo in orange and black. The band members wore similar attire. The audience smiled with joy and held their breath in excitement. Izuku felt the emotion wash over him, a happiness so intense that tears threatened to stain his cheeks. Katsuki's voice, rough and determined, told him to listen while still carrying that tough edge. Izuku covered his mouth with both hands. A soft, beautiful melody rose from the piano and filled the space. The music wrapped around Izuku's heart with a mix of love and longing. Katsuki's singing pierced him with desperate tenderness. Katsuki sang about a time when the sky fell apart and how a single dawn could be enough. He compared the other to the sunlight that broke through clouds, calling him both his sun and his chaos, while he described himself as the moon who would always be there. He declared that because the other was like fire, the melody of his soul and his savior, he would always remember him. He spoke of living long enough to see that smile full of stars and dreams, asking if the other would be happy by his side and expressing a wish for a life lived with passion. He promised that even if one day the other disappeared and left the moon alone, he would always remember him and asked only that he promise to be happy until the end of time. He vowed that even if the universe collapsed, he would hold his hand. The song carried the room and held Izuku there, held together by the sound and by the presence of the man at the piano. The song made Izuku cry. He felt desperate and did not want to let go. Around them the audience went wild. Despite everything, he felt very happy. Katsuki was singing for him and only for him. Katsuki rose from his seat, grabbed the microphone, and shouted that he loved him, calling him nerd and declaring that this was the most important concert of his life. He picked up his guitar and the show went on. For Katsuki, all the work had been worth it. Izuku's smile was everything to him. His heart was in that song and his love in the melody. Under the spotlights, Izuku could only laugh and cry. People around them murmured and pointed, but it did not matter. Their last concert was beautiful. Izuku shouted that he loved Kaken, and Katsuki smiled honestly, without any trace of hostility. Te amo, that was all Izuku could think. Katsuki sang the song he had written. The lyrics were translated into English in Izuku's mind as the melody filled the air. There was a time when the sky fell. Each shard destroyed the world, but only one sunrise was everything to me. The sunlight through the clouds that was you. You are my sun and my chaos. Darling, I am the moon who will always be with you. Because you are fire. The melody of my soul and my savior. We will always remember you. Because you are fire. A fire that will always be with me. I have lived long enough to see you smile. Your smile is full of stars and dreams. Tell me, will you be happy by my side? You only want me to live my life with passion. Because you are fire. The melody of my soul and my savior. We will always remember you. Because you are fire. A fire that will always be with me. If one day you disappear and leave the moon alone, I will always remember you. But promise me that you will be happy until the end. Darling, even if the universe collapses, I will hold your hand. After the concert, the headlines went crazy with rumors about a romance between Ground Zero's lead singer and the famous writer Midoriya Izuku. Izuku laughed, Katsuki frowned, and then both of them smiled. 5 hard months had passed. For Izuku it had become impossible to eat without help. He could barely hold utensils and moving was nearly impossible. Still, Izuku had anticipated this and had written the letters he needed, with his father's help he had managed to finish his book. Despite everything, he was grateful to be alive. Being alive gave him more time with his family and with Kaken. There had been pain and tears, but Katsuki held his hand, just like the sweet song had said. Katsuki had nicknamed it the nerd song. They watched movies until they were bored, ate until they could not eat anymore, and above all they shared endless hugs and gentle kisses. The days felt like cotton candy and chocolates. One morning the clock read 6. The sun was just waking and coloring the world with vivid tones. Izuku closed his eyes and slept a while longer. When he opened them again, he found Katsuki sitting beside the bed. Katsuki slipped his hand into Izuku's and Izuku rested his cheek on it, smiling warmly. Katsuki frowned, wondering why he always did that. It made no sense but felt like home. For Izuku, Katsuki was the meaning of home, a place to return to and to cherish. With effort, Izuku reached for Katsuki's shirt and leaned in, giving him a soft, tender kiss that left them both grinning like fools. Later, Izuku whispered his gratitude. He thanked Katsuki for existing, for being born, for staying by his side, for letting him be close, and for loving him. His voice held both joy and a gentle sadness as he wondered why he had to say goodbye. He could feel his condition worsening by the day and barely felt his fingers. Katsuki listened, his own fear showing in a quiet way. He had not always spoken openly about his feelings, but he had trusted the old letters and drawings to show what his heart could not. He confessed that he thought he had fallen in love with Izuku since high school, maybe even earlier, but had never found the courage to say it. He admitted that he could be an idiot, not very sentimental, and awkward with these things. That was why he had written the letters, to clumsily put into words what he could not say in person. He regretted the years they had lost because of his pride and panic. They could have made more memories and shared more happiness, but he had pushed Izuku away when Izuku had tried to come closer. He also confessed that, even though he had wanted to lash out in frustration, that never erased the love he felt. He told Izuku that the anger had been mixed with a deeper affection, that Izuku made him feel vulnerable, and that he was grateful that Izuku was still alive. Izuku could not hold back his tears when he said that he loved Katsuki. Katsuki held him tightly, bearing the weight of the fear that life could be cruel. Izuku wanted to live. He held on to every moment, afraid that he would soon be only a memory. They found comfort in shared silences, in the ordinary rituals of life, and in the steady presence of one another. When a scene had to be left out of their past, a short, quiet memory bridged the gap and they kept walking forward together, holding hands. The song remained between them, a small pledge of a love that had weathered fear and found its voice. The vast sky was mottled. Whitish clouds disturbed the pale blue, giving it a blend of colors. Izuku smiled at the magnificent view. Waiting for Kaken sometimes felt as though time had stopped. He was on the hospital roof, helped and settled in the center by his mother. He breathed with difficulty. The fresh air felt dreamlike, irresistible and wonderful. Izuku loved being outside, loved the way the leaves danced. He placed a hand over his chest. Heaven and hell seemed within reach, both alluring. His heart sought them with a desperate calm. Years of suffering were shrinking to a final breath. He smiled even as breathing became harder. Holding air in his lungs was not easy. For days his chest had felt heavy. A lump formed in his throat. Was it so hard to give up? He had been fighting day and night, but perhaps there came a time to let go. He pictured surrender and the numbness that followed. Inko watched her son. He looked so tired, distant and thin. Izuku struggled to eat and to move. Each day grew more difficult. She would not cry, she told herself. Suddenly she saw Izuku tense, give a small cry and clutch his chest. Without thinking, Inko pressed the hospital emergency button that was in every ward. She moved to him and felt Izuku grasp her hand. Panic rose. What would she do if he was gone? This had happened before. How long could he hold out? Why did her child have to suffer so much? After a moment, she watched them carry Izuku away on a stretcher and waited a few minutes to use the elevator. Inko kept repeating that she did not want to stop being a mother as her hands trembled. She searched her coat pocket for her phone. Walking down the corridors felt endless and disorienting. Her vision blurred and tears threatened to fall. She sent a message and finally reached the emergency wing. Izuku was on the stretcher, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. Medical staff had applied oxygen and removed his shirt to treat him. Inko fell into a chair in the waiting room, biting her lip as time dragged torturously. She felt a hand on her shoulder and saw Katsuki standing there, nervous and confused. Inko told him that it had happened again. Katsuki blinked, unwilling to believe it, and asked what had happened. Inko wrapped her arms around him and after a few seconds began to cry. Katsuki kept blinking. Deep down he feared Izuku's heart might not survive another episode, but he refused to accept it. Inko stepped away and stared at a spot on the wall, clinging to the hope that Izuku would be all right, that she would see his smile again, that she could tell him she loved him once more. Katsuki rubbed his arms over and over as if to steady them, overwhelmed by a vast chasm of reality closing in. Without thinking, he rose and walked toward the door through which they had taken Izuku. He clenched his fists and started pounding on it, frantic attempts by a man on the verge of losing everything. Katsuki screamed for them to bring his friend back alive and cursed as his pride fell away, leaving only pain. Toshinori stepped forward, took Katsuki by the shoulders and forced him to lift his head. Both men could not hold back their tears. They streamed down Katsuki's cheeks as he anguished over years lost and words unsaid. Toshinori offered a sympathetic smile and conveyed that he understood. Toshinori told him that they were in this together, addressing Katsuki directly. Katsuki turned slowly and met Mitsuki's ruby eyes. Mitsuki watched him with concern, approached and gently touched Katsuki's cheeks with her fingertips, wiping his face before pulling him into a long embrace. Bakugo breathed in and out repeatedly. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor. After a moment he pushed his mother away and covered his face with both hands. He sobbed, inconsolable, feeling as if he were about to fall into a pit of grief. He could not imagine living without Izuku. The thought of losing his world felt like being plunged into hell. Katsuki begged and pleaded that Izuku not die, the words raw and desperate. He could not stop crying. Everything felt like chaos. Back in the emergency room, the mechanical oxygen filled Izuku's lungs and a calm settled over him as he realized what was coming. He thought about taking one last breath and felt weight lift from his shoulders. Peace mingled with regret. He reflected on how hard he had tried to live with them, with Kaken, how he had fought. He hoped he would not be forgotten and that he might see them again in another life. He thought of love and of meeting the sky once more. Electrical sensations flickered through him, and his eyes resisted opening. The thoughts slowed, the world faltered, and time seemed to crack. Izuku's breathing stopped and his presence drifted away. On that day, the world felt briefly dimmed. A doctor announced that they had lost him. The doctor moved slowly, dabbing his forehead with a cotton handkerchief. He counted to 10. Delivering this kind of news filled him with shame and guilt. Those two unpleasant sensations collided, and he genuinely felt hurt and miserable. His steps grew slower the closer he came. He opened the door, took in the faces of the deceased's family and friends, and saw anxiety and devastation. He breathed deeply and apologized, explaining that they had not been able to save him. Katsuki was consumed by a wave of rage. He lunged at the doctor, seizing him in a desperate, furious motion. A terrifying silence fell over the room. Katsuki demanded how the doctor could say that Izuku was dead and questioned how that could be if the man was supposed to be a doctor. He clenched his fists, the word dead repeating in his mind until he could barely deny the reality any longer. The expression on the doctor's face was wretched and broken. Katsuki begged for Izuku to be returned to him, insisting he wanted him back alive. Desperation and anguish showed in his face as he sobbed and finally released the doctor. He struck the chair in front of him repeatedly, his movements frantic and uncontrollable as he insisted he wanted Izuku back. Everyone around him watched in stunned silence. Mitsuki stepped forward with resolve and struck Katsuki firmly in the stomach to halt him. Mitsuki told him she knew how much it hurt and urged him to calm down. Katsuki fell to his knees and she whispered soothingly in his ear. Like an infant seeking a parent's comfort, he clung to her and cried, shaking and sobbing. Inko latched onto Toshinori and they both closed their eyes. They mourned the loss of their son, the light of their lives. Todoroki observed with tears trailing down his flushed cheeks, overwhelmed by questions about his best friend, who would laugh with him, who would listen and give advice, who would receive his friendship now after so many years together. Everything felt dark. Katsuki rose, walked away, and headed for the exit. No one spoke. It seemed best to leave him alone. The cold air struck his face as he stepped outside. Katsuki asked Izuku aloud to whom he would give his love now, his voice carrying into the distance as the stars seemed remote and indifferent, as if watching the scene with a cruel amusement. He crouched and took a deep breath. His tears fell freely and violently. Like Todoroki, he was left with only questioning thoughts and no answers. In the end, it felt as if even the moon would remain alone forever. Katsuki took a deep breath and wondered if it was already morning. He got up lazily and walked to the window. The pedestrians below moved with irritating energy. He clicked his tongue and wondered why there were so many people. Women and children passed by here and there, and men in dark suits wore haughty expressions. He clenched his fingers as the sun's rays fully lit his face, giving his eyes an intense gleam, like two sparkling rubies. Blinking, he returned to the bed and stared at the ceiling. 2 days had passed since Izuku died. 2 days since the burial, 2 miserable and unbearable days. Katsuki suddenly remembered a phrase Izuku had once said about wanting to stick glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. He blinked again. He wanted that, as childish as always, he thought. Katsuki murmured that even in the simplest things he could remember him. He stood and looked around at the wrecked room. In the middle of the mess, he found the package of glow-in-the-dark stars he had bought days earlier, long before everything went to pieces. For a moment he surprised even Mitsuki by coming out of his room. He took a small ladder, walked back, and shut the door with a kick. Katsuki said that it was unbearably sad, but he needed to do it. He asked himself the worst unanswered question of his existence. He tilted his head, searching for courage and calm, placed the ladder under the center of the ceiling, and began to stick the stars. 1, 2, 3, many. After 20 minutes, the whole ceiling was covered. He sighed and cursed under his breath. The ladder wobbled for a moment and he fell forward onto the floor, but he only smiled. It no longer mattered to feel pain. Izuku had taken his soul with him, and he could not bear the sunlight. He whispered that he could not bring himself to see or feel the sun. Suddenly someone called his name. Ignoring it, he went to the bed and pulled the covers over himself. He did not want to see or hear anyone. The voice calling grew louder, and, fed up with the situation, he pulled the covers off in one movement and snapped that they should leave him alone. He met Shoto Todoroki's impassive gaze. Shoto took in Katsuki's disheveled hair and swollen eyes and frowned. He thought Izuku would not like to see him in this state. Izuku would not have wanted to know that Bakugo had cried so much. He tilted his head and held out a black box. Katsuki raised an eyebrow and wondered what was in it. He was about to throw it away when Todoroki explained that it was from Izuku, that everyone had received something and Izuku had asked Shoto to deliver this one in person. Shoto added that Izuku had always been organized and had anticipated things to the end. Katsuki took the box, closed the door, and watched Shoto leave. His hands.